So I had this client in my first year of private practice, which is like 8 or 9 years ago now. And they were telling me this story about a holiday visit that they did with their family. Like, let's just call the client Jane. And the client was in their 50s. They had a very highly abusive, highly dysfunctional family, very tricky family. And this client had been the family scapegoat since the beginning. And their siblings were treated differently, which is pretty typical. And one was actually still living at home in their 50s, which was a whole other thing. And Jane was telling me that on this visit, that the whole family was in the kitchen and the sibling was at the sink, and the sibling picked up a dish from like the dish rack and then just kind of said, "Oh, this is dirty. Jane must have done this one." And they said this casually and like automatically, without any irony or any kind of funny humor to it, because Jane hadn't lived there in decades. And in addition, she'd only been in the house for like 45 minutes and she hadn't touched a dish there since like 1997. Yet there was this opportunity to try to publicly blame or crap on Jane's character in that moment by the sibling. You could step back into your family system after being gone for decades, and they will pick up right where you left off with them. And what I find is that unless the family itself had gone through a major therapeutic change, or even like the most abusive person or the most protective abusive person passes away, this stuff doesn't really change. But I was thinking, why though? Why was that comment so automatic? As if it was like a kid's game about good guys and bad guys that had never ended, had gone on for decades. Family systems are really systems. Like a beehive is a system. Bees have roles that contribute to affect the whole hive. And a beehive's function is to produce or survive, like make honey and create community, like that kind of a thing. This video is about how a family scapegoat contributes to the function of the overall system. And we tend to look at it almost like the family is just treating Jane horrifically, but it serves a bigger nefarious purpose in the dysfunctional family system. Abusive family systems, conscious or not, assign roles to family members to contribute to the system's survival or the self-interest of the parents, like covering something up or funneling pain or blame or shame into like ulterior motives onto one person in the family system. So the definition of a scapegoat is a person who is blamed for the wrongdoings, the mistakes, or the faults of others, especially for reasons of expediency. Or I read expediency as simply convenience. And we'll come back to that term convenience later, as it's really going to help us look at the function of the scapegoated kid. Being the family scapegoat is truly a horrific experience for a child. We're so like used to the term, it's kind of like a pop psych term now, that I think it's lost its impact about when you think about it in terms of a child's world. And you'll identify with this role or identify with this video if you experienced any of the following abusive family dynamics. One is that you were consistently blamed in a combination of either casual quips to like major family attacks. Like if something went wrong or was out of your control, they would find a reason to put you on the spot about it. Like, you're the reason we have a flat tire because you wanted to go to pizza on your birthday, and you're being blamed and shamed for really appropriate kid needs or kid experiences. We can now know that now. Like, well, if I hadn't go to your parent-teacher conference, your sister wouldn't have gotten into trouble. You know, that's being blamed for needing basic parental functions and blamed for the other people's mistakes or decisions. You're consistently told stories like, my life was okay with 2 kids, but then I had my 3rd, which was you, and my life tanked, which is like being blamed for existing when you didn't ask for it. It's like really getting the feeling like you're a burden to the family. We wouldn't be in this mess if you picked better friends like your brother does. Who left the lights on? You left the lights on, but you weren't home. Like being blamed for things that didn't involve you, like the Jane dish thing. It also could look like siblings could easily pin things on you, being blamed for things that others do, or you're consistently held to impossible standards. Like, you're 8 now, you should be able to handle a bully. This is being blamed for your developmental stage. Or scapegoated. I can't believe I left work to take you to the hospital kind of stuff. Blame for needing care. You're not considerate enough or pious enough or smart enough or like me enough to be acceptable in this family, but keep trying though. All of that involves intense blame that becomes the child's inner world and conditioning. And notice how there's a lot of magical thinking on behalf of the parent and a lot of that stuff. If I didn't have to go to your parent-teacher conference, I'd have been available for the child that I like more. That's a big stretch, and it's like a big flex. It's also playing God in terms of assigning why things happen in the family at the expense of this scapegoated child, which becomes the catch-all for all the other stuff that happens in the family in a really unfair way. A toxic parent will go out of their way or even become obsessed with damning the scapegoat's kind of existence. Kids don't have the power to not identify all that as gaslighty BS from a very ill person. As kids, we just kind of have to accept that's what we are. We're this terrible kid and blah, 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 blah. Now let's look at what being scapegoated as a child looks like in our adulthoods. What happens to us as adults growing up after being placed in that family role. In the infographic here, I've outlined a scale of what happens to the scapegoated child. It looks like just two options here, but think of it as degrees to this, with the red arrow being in the middle and also pointing to shared commonalities. On the left, we have a child who learned to rebel, and on the right, we have a child who learned to comply. Both are bullied. Both are coming up with strategies on how to respond to the bullying in the family. You can show signs of both qualities. That can definitely happen depending on the situation, or you can really be rooted in more one over the other. Let's now plug in a client who was scapegoated as a child. A trauma survivor just like you and me who is triggered to something in the present. Let's just say like a scenario like a boss unfairly implies in a work meeting that they'd like you to take on more initiative with communicating with other teams instead of being asked to by them. And it's kind of like, you know, you should take the bull by the horns and we like self-starters here and you should all be talking and read my mind despite me saying earlier that don't bog other people down. And it's like a typical corporate BS-y kind of experience that maybe somebody else who isn't a scapegoat would just kind of nod their head and roll their eyes internally and just kind of like blah, 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 blah. They wouldn't take it so personally. This kind of thing, though, is very triggering to a childhood trauma survivor. A rebel scapegoated client might crack a passive-aggressive joke in the moment, or they might become really persnickety about protocol or want to get into specifics about roles, like trying to catch the hypocrisy in the adult's BS. So you want us to all talk, but then not distract each other at the same time. I'm not saying that that client is wrong to do that in the moment. I'm more focusing on their kind of scapegoated trigger reactions. Then the rebel might get really, really triggered. Maybe they'll steal some Post-it notes from the supply room, or they may seek out ways to get back or sabotage things, like mess with the Xerox machine like they're Captain Chaos or something. And I'm speaking to this from personal experience here, so don't feel like I'm just calling you out. If the boss were to do something similar to another coworker, this scapegoated like rebel client might go into a hero mode and try to speak on behalf of the other employee to protect them. It's another quality of the rebellious scapegoat. The rebel might jump on a grenade to prove a point to everyone, like at sort of the authority's expense there. This client is projecting. They're projecting their parental abuse around authority and hypocrisy onto the boss and acting out unconsciously from there. It's like they are bringing a fight to something in the present that doesn't necessarily belong there. And in no way am I saying that the boss isn't sort of the top. The boss could be toxic. The boss could be totally BS-y and corporate. It could be totally gross and crazy making. But it doesn't sort of matter for our purposes, because two things are true at the same time here, is that in the present, it's still a mess, but the person is reacting from a very like memorable experience in their childhood, and they have control over their reactions. That's what I mean about that stuff. So this kind of scapegoated kid might have really suffered in school, this rebellious scapegoat. They might have really suffered in jobs, like getting into it with professors or partners, by trying to point out hypocrisy in the wrong places. That's what I mean. So many of us has watched a scapegoated sibling self-destruct like this and not being able to get out of their own way because of these issues. Many of us also saw a sibling like this, or it was actually us, constantly getting emotionally abused and beat down to the point in our families that they started fighting back, but it's like they got stuck in that mode. Now, on the right, the opposite kind of scapegoat would go into a shame hole at that suggestion from the boss. They might try to overly apologize for it. They might give up all of their power to the meeting or to the boss and really cave into suggestions that are going to feel more like orders instead of just like kind of BS-y corporate stuff that they can let roll off their back. So they may really become caretakers in the family, extremely vigilant around making mistakes or anticipating that they'll be found out, like in things like imposter syndrome. They may jump on a grenade because they believe in some way that they manufactured the grenade and it's all their fault. So both of these types were abused around power. So one refuses to give it up and the other one gives it up way too freely. They actually can learn from each other here. Both were shamed, blamed, and abandoned, and both consistently project their parents onto others. The rebel projects that people will mess with them, and the compliant scapegoat projects that people are always upset with them. Lastly, both are highly overly in tune with what's potentially coming to them. Both would be saying, I knew it, when the boss makes that comment about the initiative thing. So that's their childhood trauma of being the scapegoated kid still living and driving them in the present. And yes, these ideas about the scapegoat scale can be weaved in with things like codependency. If you're new to me or new to the channel, welcome. If you like this video, feel free to hit some buttons on the screen. You really can't miss with any of the buttons, specifically the subscribe button and the like button. And if you feel like these videos are helpful to you in your recovery, you can consider supporting the work that goes into this channel over at my Patreon. In addition, you can go to my website and check out some childhood trauma e-coursework that I offer there, including an upcoming training that I'm doing for therapists who are interested in learning my mentor Amanda Curtin's model of therapy called the RRP model. This would be a level 1 training, and you can follow the white ball, I think, up here or up here to register and look for some info on that course. It's really a great live opportunity for therapists, holistic practitioners, and life coaches to go way beyond the idea of just being trauma informed. You can also get in touch with me through my website, and you can connect with me through my Instagram and my TikTok, and I'll have all the links in the description below in this video. Now let's take a brief look at how adults who grew up as the family scapegoat tend to get triggered. If you identify with being the family scapegoat, I really want you to take some notes here because it's very helpful to become aware and track the ways that you get triggered or the things that come up, because we really can't get out of our triggers unless we're able to see the patterns and identify them. Scapegoated kids become hypervigilant because their parents were making them unsafe to be themselves. The two types of scapegoats on that scale grew up in homes where they were blamed, shamed, and abused simply for being themselves or simply for being kids. Issues that come up for scapegoated trauma survivors tend to look like things like this. Mistakes. In the present, mistakes have a huge charge to them because they tend to cue what's going to be coming next to the mistake, like punishment or contempt from a parent. So we are hyper vigilant about not making any and being too keyed up around mistakes. Next is accusations, like that boss in that meeting. When we know this trigger and what it takes us back to, we can value ourselves more and we have a better chance of deciding about whether the criticism is valid or not. But we can't do that if we're massively triggered. Another is carelessness of others. We were vigilant about what could come back to us. Ever had a group project in college? Like, holy stuff, like that is some of the most annoying triggering that can happen. And the trigger is usually about either having to do all the work, and for some it's about being blamed for the group failure unfairly and anticipating that. Another is potential disasters. Scapegoated children, like I mentioned with the parent-teacher conference, they start to anxiously seek out things or think of things that could go wrong, which is really horrible to do to a child. Like, dad's gonna get stressed out about my birthday and get really drunk, so I just won't have a birthday. Like, see all that kind of forecasting that happens there. Another is social groups. My mentor says that our first group is really our family. And really say no more. It is really in groups that our inner child anticipates being blamed or humiliated or shunned. And it's actually very powerful to join a therapy group or reclaim groups and experience the opposite of what our families kind of told us what would happen in a group. Another is feedback. Feedback is often wrecked because it comes from a very twisted place, from our parents, from our family. So it really takes time to sort out and making sense of feedback in the present. Like, what does it really mean as opposed to what we feel that it means? In other words, like, just stuff happens. Like, what I mean here is the scapegoated adult might hate themselves for picking a restaurant and there's a line when they get there. We're so used to blame that when a non-fault or simply human experience comes up in the present, there's a charge to it. Like, what would your parents say if they were with you when you suggested a restaurant to your friends and you get there and it's like an hour late? The parent would probably say, like, if they were on your little shoulder there, saying like, well, once again, you could have called ahead, but now all your friends have to dive on their phone and figure out something else because you didn't think ahead. In my family growing up, anything that happened was always someone's fault instead of things just going wrong, because life is just kind of messy that way. So let's now get into what the function in the family of the scapegoat is. Coming back to the function of the scapegoat, or why a toxic family needs one, is let's look at some scenarios from different types of families. I'd really like you to get some clarity and meaning that being the scapegoated kid wasn't about who you were. It was about parental illness, it was about their mistakes and their choices, but they made it to be about you. A while back, I did a video on 7 types of toxic family systems. Let's look at a few of these to see how each system might need a child or even somebody else to be the family scapegoat. As a side note, anybody in the family can be this family scapegoat, and in some ways, families like mine, the scapegoat person changed from day to day. Like, I always say that one of us was always in the doghouse, except the one person. And I'm not saying it always happens in these specific ways. I'm just trying to get you to think about what function does a scapegoated kid serve in your family system. So up first, let's look at the looks good on paper family. A child in the looks good on paper family will be scapegoated around not doing enough to keep up the family's image up to snuff. The function of such a scapegoat will be an example to the other children, like, don't end up like Jane and do the dishes wrong. The function can also be to reinforce the lie that looking good is the ultimate valued thing in the family. Like, for example, you didn't get A's. You clammed up at the music recital and made a mistake. You didn't get into the right school. You didn't date the right kind of person. Therefore, you fail as a person. But you failing strengthens the family myth, instead of them just simply valuing who you are and loving you for being different. It's an opportunity for the family to double down on that appearance thing. It's like, what would a fundamentalist church be without sinners? The scapegoat here is also a distraction from the reality that the family is really off emotionally. It's a distraction from, say, a bad or an odd marriage or a very unhappy marriage. And it's also a distraction, could be a distraction from, say, like abusive siblings or siblings acting out. See, Jane didn't get into the right school now, so now we can all act self-righteous and not acknowledge or talk about how we're all dead inside and we don't know how to connect. That's the smoke and mirrors about why a kid will get really sort of singled out and attacked in a family like that. So next, let's look at something called the chaos system. Say in this very chaotic and neglectful family system that a child is scapegoated. And I find, like, in a system like this, it's usually around not enabling bad behavior, not having needs, or not fulfilling a parental role, like being parentified. Why didn't you change the baby's diaper and you're like 4? Why do you always have to make a stink about my drinking when I'm drunk driving? Why didn't you clean up the house for the family visit and you're like 8? The function of the scapegoat here is a very crazy-making experience, because chaotic systems where the parents are often using substances or they're extremely neglectful on all fronts is usually about making waves, that the child is making waves or having a normal reaction to the abuse. It's a lot of like, why are you crying, and bringing up stuff. Your brother didn't bring up that I was drunk and had a random stranger over for his birthday, but you did. Your brother gave me a break, why can't you? Like, that's the function, that the child is, the myth that the child is persecuting the adult and the adult is using that drama to distract from the reality that they're actually a very neglectful or abusive parent. See how that message is about being blamed for having basic needs, and how the brother is the better child because he gave the abusive parents a pass. It's probably pretty common in a lot of our family systems. This is extremely gaslighting, and the function of the scapegoat is like, see what happens when people try to hold me accountable. I make an example out of them by shaming them. And using the scapegoated child, the parents create the image that they are victimized by the child while completely negating their parental duties. Like, who is the real victim here? As a side note, when a parent is like this and tries to look parental, it feels like a huge hypocritical betrayal, because it is. Like when that parent is in a parent-teacher conference and like, oh yeah, I always cue Timmy to do his homework, but he never does. And they're like never home because they're out drinking or neglectful or just running their own life. How would that feel to the child? That's what I mean by a hypocritical betrayal. So let's do one more. In the aggressor codependent family system, a scapegoated child can sometimes serve as a distraction from, say, bigger marital problems. So the aggressive parent, let's just say that they're in a violent or aggressive mood, and the 4-year-old makes a screechy loud sound, as 4-year-olds do, because the older sibling is like either tickling them or took a toy or whatever, and the aggressive parent totally freaks out and abuses the whole house. The other parent, usually highly codependent and not protective, blames the 4-year-old for causing all that violent freak out because of the other parent. What's the function there? What's the smoke and mirrors? The aggressive parent gets to be self-righteous and blames their toxic feelings, their miserable life choices, their mental health on the normal 4-year-old, and includes the siblings as if the kids are all causing their internal mess. I'm talking about the aggressive parent here. And the codependent parent gets to blame the child for the toxic marriage stuff, their life choices, the toxic feelings, their misery. Blame all that on the 4-year-old and sort of say, you should know better when dad is in a mood. The siblings get to blame the 4-year-old because that's what they're learning from the adults. So you see how one kid becomes the catch-all for so many of other things. The 4-year-old here is nothing but a distraction, and it's a created drama about winners and losers at the cost of the child's developmental journey. The parents and the siblings can all negate or forget about that they're all in a highly toxic, abusive system, and they can even feel cheaply bonded at the expense of the 4-year-old who did nothing but be a normal 4-year-old. Now let's get into how to work on the scapegoated trauma piece. If you identify as a family scapegoat, here are some things I'd like you to journal about and develop into sort of a practice of thinking about things differently. So the journal prompt number 1, coming back to that infographic about the scale. Do you identify more as a compliant scapegoat, or do you identify more as a rebellious scapegoat, or are you kind of a combination of both? When you're triggered to those issues, such as projecting or defending yourself or overly accepting, how do you behave? Are you overly apologetic? Do you take things way too personally, become defensive? Do you start forecasting that you're going to get in trouble or things are going to go south, and you're really kind of in that thought process? Think back to that recent example, like in that meeting with the boss. How might have you behaved or reacted from your scapegoated trauma stuff? How did you feel? Did your reaction fully belong in the present? Would you have called it an over-the-top reaction, and would you have liked to have been different in it? How specifically? Even the simple thing of not saying anything if you're a rebel and speaking up if you're a compliant are huge behavioral changes that we can start practicing in the present. So that's the first journal prompt. I know that's a lot. The second journal prompt is come up with 2 to 3 scenarios from childhood as best as you can where you were set up for that reaction that you listed in prompt 1. Meaning a rebellious scapegoat is doing all this stuff for good reason because they were usually scapegoated in profoundly unfair ways, and they were set up to overly react and be overly preoccupied with fairness. Were you constantly criticized or put on the spot in childhood? How specifically? Were you blamed for things out of your control in childhood? How specifically? Were you made an example of compared to your siblings in childhood? How specifically? You need that context and that content of your story as best as you can to refer back to it the next time you're triggered to this stuff. Prompt number 3 is write about your function in your abusive family as the family scapegoat. Like in the toxic family system slides that I just kind of gave. Did your role distract from bigger things going on in the family, like a narcissistic parent or a codependent parent? Even if you are a single parent, the rules still apply. Did you become a catch-all for all the miserable feelings because the adults weren't interested in making their lives better? Did your parents make an example out of you to train your siblings, or keep an image going in the family that was kind of dumb and unnecessary in the grand scheme of things? Then I want you to rewrite that function, meaning kind of make a statement of, I was a good kid who needed basic parenting and my parents used me as a distraction because they were highly abusive, or it was just convenient for them to have a bad guy rather than admit that they were actually failing as a parent. It wasn't about me, but they made it about me. So when clients start in my groups, I have them think about using the group experience to I kind of challenge them to sort of say, use this group to decide about whether your parents were right about you or they were wrong about you. That's what I mean about this third prompt. So some final thoughts. The journal prompts are really about trying to get you to think differently about yourself, because as trauma survivors, our sense of self is really off because the system we grew up in was really off. When you're triggered and you're really in this stuff, you need to have some kind of inner reality testing going on to battle the childhood trauma conditioning, or kind of battle what your inner child thinks is going on. It's more like spending less time triggered in these exercises rather than being fully healed, which I think comes from ongoing long-term kind of therapy around this stuff. So I'm not sort of saying that the journal prompts are going to totally heal you. They're going to make your present better is what I'm trying to say. In my own family system, which is a lot like the chaos family system, mixed in with some aggressor codependent and a few other things, I would be scapegoated or gaslit around what parental responsibility was. I was told, like, why do I have to help you with your homework? Shouldn't you go ask somebody else? Why do I always have to make dinner? Shouldn't you go blah, 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 blah? And it took a long time and a lot of good therapy for me to not feel so indebted to the world, or apologizing for me existing, or blaming myself for having basic needs. Healing involved me learning what kids really need. It also involved learning that the criticism and shame was really just smoke and mirrors around my parents just really wanting to be left alone to be alcoholics. And that's what I mean by the function of the scapegoat. Telling me that I should behave like a fully self-sufficient 20-year-old when I'm 7 is the smoke and mirrors. It was all really about someone not wanting to take on the responsibility for being a parent that they agreed with themselves to become one. I hope this video was helpful to you, and you can feel free to check out my 7 types of toxic family systems, that video that I did, if you get stuck in your writing. And you can also check out a video that I did called Do I Gaslight Myself, which is also helpful with this stuff. And as always, may you be filled with loving kindness, may you be well, may you be peaceful and at ease, may you be joyous, and I will see you next time.